here, and it's a great crowd. Whenever Rod asks me to do something, I do it because he's a great person to work with, and King's is a great company. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, being from a university, but you guys have great products and do great education for cover crops. So as Rod said, I'm a hybrid also with research and extension, which is maybe why I don't have a jacket on today, so a little bit of both. Sorry I didn't bring my jacket. But my name is Joseph Amsili. I'm an extension associate, so I'm doing kind of like half extension, half research, working on a PhD, so I'm not all the way lost yet in the piled higher and deeper, but maybe lost in a couple years. So you got me at a good hybrid stage here. So hopefully this isn't so much review from yesterday. Maybe Jim Horman was talking about some similar things, but hopefully I'll bring some new light. And being a soil person, maybe have a little bit soil-centric view of things, and I really like thinking about roots. And I'm sorry I didn't bring any posters, but there's some great posters of these cover crop root pictures that I've taken. So we're going to talk about species selection. There's a lot of species out there, and King's AgriSeeds making it way more confusing by putting a whole bunch more cultivar. I'm just kidding. But there's a lot out there, and there's a lot to know. So how can we think about species selection for specific services that a farmer might be looking for, and maybe they're looking for a lot? So cover crop species for specific services. This is definitely overview for all of you, but good to start somewhere. Cover crops help build sustainable agricultural systems by increasing resource use efficiency, nitrogen, carbon, reducing environmental impact, reducing nitrogen, phosphorus losses. They fill these agroecological niches, both in space, interseeding, intercropping, and then also in time through putting them after our cash crops. A more agronomic definition is that we can use cover crops to perform specific functions, from Steve Groff. And ideally, we need to introduce cover crops without increasing risk to a farmer. So it's a good time to be in the cover crop business and to be working on this. And it's an exciting time because people are paying more attention to cover cropping and soil health benefits. So in the last ag census, maybe 3 or 4% of the ag land is being cover cropped, still a long way to go. And for some of those Midwestern states, it's called the number 3 crop after corn and soybeans, which is cool. So here's some different statistics as well of cover crop adoption in different states, and obviously that's influenced by how much water you got and maybe water quality concerns and things like that. So what can cover crops do for us? This is also going to be some introduction or some back overview for most of you. Here's a flow chart that I made that I like using on cover crops and their specific soil benefits. Cover crops, as they grow, they're scavenging nutrients and adding organic matter and nitrogen if they're legumes. That's stimulating the soil biology, which is helping to scavenge nutrients into those microbial cells and into the roots. That decomposition and stimulation in the soil in the soil biology is increasing that nutrient availability for our crops and also potentially suppressing disease. There's been a lot of really cool work in the last 20 years showing that a generally robust microbial community can help suppress some of our root-borne pathogens and things like that. On the physical side, fine roots and their associated arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are really known for building and maintaining those aggregates. We just know that grasses tend to be really good at that, having big root systems. And that some cover crops, we talk a lot about brassicas, can be better adapted at breaking up compaction. So both of those things help improve the pore structure of the soil, which allows roots to grow better, water to infiltrate. If water can infiltrate, then air can move in as well. So all those lead to healthy plants and ecosystems. So I really like this. This is kind of very basic, but a nice visual for showing how cover crops fit into our agricultural systems. Certain climates, you can only grow so much biomass due to the climate. Our cash crops can fit into a certain part of that. But if we really want to increase that resource use efficiency and that carbon capture, there's some additional spaces within that productivity potential that we can fit these cover crops. and that can look like here. So here's my hybrid. I'm going to be talking a lot about Penn State results today. So we get that Penn State Cornell hybrid going, and this is what that could look like. So this is a nice, probably the best meta analysis summarizing the effects of cover crops on building soil organic carbon. So we see that on average, a cover crop compared to a fallow, and obviously a cover crop is in a cover crop is in a cover crop. You can have 500 pounds biomass per acre, 2,000, 8,000. So there can be a big difference in this, but cover crops help maintain and increase soil organic carbon. There's potentially some, that might be just variability. Soil science is hard to do. Soils are very variable. And there's a potential that priming of soil organic carbon could be happening. So that's another thing that people might be talking about more in the future as well. But on the whole, cover crops increase organic carbon. It makes sense. More inputs, more organic carbon in the soil. So why should we care about roots? It's hard to follow the beautiful microscopy we just looked at. I don't have potentially as great exciting microscopy photos to show you, but there's a lot going on down there, and there's a lot that we don't understand. And being more of a field person, I just use the term rhizodeposition because it's really hard to capture all of that stuff, whether it's rhizophagy, whether it's exudates, whether it's cells sloughing off, whether it's root turnover. Rhizodeposition is just a way to call all of the organic carbon that's released while plants are growing into the soil. So one thing that got me really interested in this topic when I went to Penn State, being a naive grad student, thinking this work was easier than it was learning that it turns out that when we trace carbon into the soil, that for some reason the root carbon tends to persist longer than the above ground carbon, and potentially maybe there's twice as much above ground biomass being produced, but for some reason that root carbon tends to persist longer in the soil. So that's one thing that got me really interested in this topic. We know that roots are carbon pumps. It depends which study you look at, but we often hear the higher number on this, but I guess as a university person we gotta show all of the numbers, but this is that rhizodeposition. That might be rhizophagy, it might be fine root turnover. One of Jonathan Lynch at Penn State, who's a big root guy, he was doing some common bean work and found that half of the roots in the spring had been lost through root turnover over the season. So just getting a single root biomass sample might not be able to capture all that was there to begin with. So root competition I think is a huge part of why our cover crops do a good job at weed suppression, and why grasses tend to be so good at suppressing weeds. There's a lot of below ground that we don't understand because studying roots, I can attest to that, it's really hard. Some cover crops, I don't have the brassica on here, but brassicas are well known to do this, and sorghum Sudan grass are well adapted to break up soil compaction. And some of our cover crops, especially our grasses, and annual ryegrass especially, has very fine fibrous roots in the surface soil that can be really good at doing this. So just some beautiful nodules going. And as you guys know, the red is from that leg hemoglobin, which is an analog for the hemoglobin in our blood that shuttles oxygen around in our blood. And you know that it's active because that leg hemoglobin has to be shuttling oxygen away from those nodules so that the rhizobia can do their job in those. So weed management, I'm going to skip this, but cover crops do amazing things for weeds, and it's probably one of the most important reasons for using cover crops. Cover crops can be used as biofumigants. There's some different ones, and King's AgriSeeds has a great line of these for releasing these specific compounds that can basically biologically fumigate the soil. So I'm going to skip this as well. We know that SARE CTIC has these wonderful cover crop surveys they do every year that has some really great information. And I'm going to skip this as well. but some differences between why organic farmers and conventional farmers value cover crops. Obviously, organic farmers need to be caring about that weed suppression a little bit more because they don't have herbicides, about that nitrogen fixation because they don't have synthetic fertilizers, and then can't deal with pests and disease issues as easily. So I am probably going to skip this as well. It's good to include a potential drawback, especially if you're talking with folks from the Midwest. This is an example where a cover crop can be actually a bad thing because the fallow, all the cover crop treatments basically had lower wheat yield than the fallow, and this is a water competition. And luckily in the Northeast we don't really have to think too much about this issue. So how do we choose which cover crops are best for the best goals? And sorry, I'm not as good at walking around like this. So there's a lot of species out there. King's got a lot of cultivars. Most of our agricultural inputs just have one purpose, whereas cover crops, they're biological tools, and we're managing them to do many things at once. And we also know that if you miss the window for planting radish, it's probably not going to work to plant radish anymore. So you have to have contingency plans and be adaptive about your cover crop management. So it adds this layer of complexity. This is from Charlie White at Penn State, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard from, who's done some really great work on cover crop monocultures and mixtures. And rather than, in my mind, rather than thinking of diversity as numbers of species, I think it's really valuable to think about diversity in terms of these functional groups, whether it's a plant family. So getting 3 different plant families together is potentially better than getting 3 grasses if you want a lot of different services. And if you're really a cover crop dork, then you need the cover crop periodic table tacked into your office or wherever you think about cover crops. So that's a nice resource as well, thinking about the different options that you might have. And you guys all know this, managing cover crops profitably is a great resource. And there's a lot to know, and you need to be thinking adaptively, you need to be thinking about these windows. If you miss a window, you got to move on to the next. So yeah, there's a lot to know. And we're at an exciting time because there's some more tools being designed and developed for this cover crop selection work on the Northeast Cover Crop website. And there's going to be a council meeting, which I'm sure King's AgriSeeds is going to be represented in Maine in February or March, February. So some nice tools on using Northeast specific information, experts, agronomists, I'm sure someone from King's participated as well, of having a nice tool for the Northeast that, depending on where you're located, can bring in information from the experts for that location. Okay, so a lot of introduction to get to the brunt of what I want to be talking about is what are these species-specific effects on soil services. So a lot of this great work has happened at Rock Springs, which is a really beautiful place to work. That potentially is one of the main things I miss about Penn State, and I'm going to go there today, which will be fun to catch up with some friends. But we were working in this 3-year organic grain rotation, corn, soybean, wheat, and you can see here mostly studying the cover crops after winter wheat because, as you know, you don't get much from mixtures after corn. So you can get more from your mixtures if you get them in on time. And you can see here, this is an aerial image from early September where those cover crop plots are just starting to green up. So this is a really nice experiment, probably the oldest experiment, at least for the Northeast, that we have to understand the benefits of monocultures versus mixtures and ask that question of, do we really need a mixture for this or not? So individual cover crops have individual strengths, and the largest probably difference is this difference between a grass, cereal rye, that workhorse grass, and Austrian winter pea. You can see that cereal rye, and a lot of that Penn State work has shown that it's really hard to beat that above ground biomass production of cereal rye alone. So if you're looking for just above ground biomass, weed suppression, nitrogen, scavenging, maybe it's just rye that you need. But it turns out an organic system, rye before corn, doesn't always go so well. So the nitrogen supply is a really huge issue. So you can kind of see with these spider plots that there's some really important complementarity between these two. And these trade-offs are inherent. Sometimes we can't get everything from our cover crops. So depending on what our goals are, is going to depend on what we choose. So here's also some nice research from my master's advisor, Jason Kay. They collect the most extractable nitrogen samples of anybody I know of on the planet. They do this every 2 weeks, which is crazy in my opinion, but they have some really good data on different cover crop species effects on nitrogen scavenging. And you can see fallow's the worst case scenario, nothing there. A lot of nitrogen in the soil that's available to leach. Down in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, it turns out that our legumes are also bad at this, and they're pretty leaky. And we talked a little bit before, there's probably a lot of root turnover that's happening while those things are growing, and that's being able to mineralize and leach into the soil. And their tissues are also much lower in carbon nitrogen ratio. So when any of that breaks off, that's going to mineralize quickly. And our winter killed cover crops aren't as good. There's nothing there in the spring, so there's going to be no nitrogen scavenging. But basically anything that survives the winter that's a grass or brassica or any mixture, even with Charlie White's found that even a small amount of grass, 15% or so, in a mixture with legumes can provide this benefit as well. So grasses and brassicas that overwinter are the best at reducing nitrogen leaching. And obviously a lot of you have experienced this probably, but that grass cover crops can compete with our cash crops for nitrogen, and that directly has to do with that carbon to nitrogen ratio concept. So here's cover crops before corn silage and their effect on corn silage yield, and you can see a really large yield effect comparing Austrian winter pea, which has a really nice high quality residue that when it breaks down is going to release a huge amount of nitrogen, versus cereal rye. So in organic systems, this can be a real big problem because you can't manage it with extra nitrogen. So this whole Penn State group's all about asking the question, can mixtures provide a greater suite of services than monocultures? And I think this is a really good illustration, because I think if you want a certain, let's say, yield here, maybe this is specific to an organic system, but if you want yield, you might not be able to do as good as just that Austrian winter pea alone, but having them both together provides a greater suite of services and helps to reduce some of those weaknesses of that cereal rye for nitrogen supply. So now I'm transitioning to some of my master's work at Penn State in this same experiment. Here, there was 12 treatments, but when you do root work, you gotta reduce the treatments because washing roots takes a huge amount of time. So I just looked at crimson clover as a legume representative, triticale as that grass representative, and canola as that brassica representative, and then a 3-species mix containing those. And this is what I did some root work on. So this is some of my fall data on my cover crop root biomass data. And it was pretty amazing to see that maybe this is in carbon, so you can multiply by 2 basically to see what the biomass, maybe only 2,000 pounds of biomass per acre in that fall from that triticale, but almost an equal amount of root biomass below ground. So looking out there and you see something lame in the fall, see not a lot of biomass potentially in the early stages, there's a lot of biomass below ground that is doing a lot. So some huge differences in root biomass between these species, especially between that grass and that legume, which I think fits with our understanding of grasses generally producing huge root systems. So this is some of my spring data showing also huge differences and showing that triticale had that most amount of root biomass below ground than that brassica or legume. And this work is hard to do because probably there was a lot of turnover of those legume roots in between those sampling points that you can't capture with just these single points. So that's real. But just using my data, I made this illustration to show kind of the benefits. If we're just interested in biomass above ground and below ground, because we know that for some reason the roots are special in terms of those soil health benefits and adding carbon to the soil, we can think of triticale as being the best, crimson clover as having the lowest biomass, and then canola and the mixture as being intermediate. One of my biggest findings, and I think the thing that stuck out to me the most, was that the reason that triticale had so much roots, more roots below ground, was it was getting more roots into that between row space much better than the other two, the brassica and legume. So about like 2 to 3 times as much root biomass in that between row space, which might, I think, also has to do with that. Those roots are accessing more space in the soil, which makes sense for being great nitrogen scavengers. It also makes sense for weed competition, having more roots into that, but in more of the space of the soil, sucking up nutrients and water and competing with weeds. I always think about like a oat stand. You can see so much bare soil from above those oats, but usually it's pretty good at suppressing weeds, even though you see a lot of soil bare. So, but we also need to think about carbon and nitrogen ratio. So can cover crop mixtures improve root traits compared to monocultures? I think you can kind of get something intermediate if that's what you're looking for. You can run into a lot of problems with having a lot of roots that have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio below ground for nitrogen availability for the following cash crop. So combining them can give you a good mixture. So this is hot off the press, and this was something I was excited to work up, and I probably could have worked it up a little bit better so it'd be more easy to absorb. But this is really cool results, especially for a field person. People do greenhouse studies and find this type of stuff, but this is the first time I think this finding's been found in like a 20-acre field experiment. And as a field person, when you find it in the field in a 20-acre field experiment, we know there's huge amounts of variability out there. That means, I think, means a lot. It means it's real, and we should pay attention to it. So this is, I should have put the pictures like you did to recognize the amount of work that my colleague Zhang did. A lot of fractionation work. So this is this first graph, and there's too much graphs and data here, but is looking at the total above ground, is looking at the total shoot biomass and root biomass over 3 consecutive cover cropping times. So this is 2012 to 2019. So we have 3 different, basically adding up those 3 different cover crop biomass, because it turns out there wasn't much difference in the cash crop yield data, which would be the other part of the story. So I'm just focusing on the cover crop part of the story. Okay, so this is even more, but basically all the cover crops increase soil organic carbon compared to the fallow. I guess that's good to hear. When I tried to do that in 2017, we didn't find that yet, and sometimes variability makes that difficult to do. But what I want you to focus on is this part, so you're going to be potentially seeing a lot more of this as we're talking about soil carbon sequestration, people talking about different fractions of organic matter. So these are these 2 that I think are becoming more widespread, at least in research, is this particulate organic matter fraction. That's basically just particulates of roots and shoots and stuff like that. And then carbon that's associated with fine silt and clay is basically, it turns out that maybe, I guess I'll say on average, maybe a majority of carbon stored in the soil is not this particulate stuff. It's the stuff that's finally held on to fine silt and clay particles. So what's really cool, and this is, I took too long to get there maybe, but that although crimson clover has less above ground and root biomass inputs, there's a greater amount of that carbon associated with this mineral associated fraction, which is important because the people studying this kind of stuff are saying that the mineral associated fraction, the carbon that's associated with that is relatively more stable, is going to persist longer in the soil than this particulate stuff. It's important, and it's more of the stuff that's can be cycled more readily available. But this stuff's kind of more protected by those minerals. So this is kind of backing off a little bit. So basically, he did a huge amount of lab work and biomarker work to understand this. And I'm just showing just a part of this. So this is the total plant biomarker things, and this is the things we'd expect to end up in particulate organic matter. Those grass or brassica, above ground and below ground components that can persist in the soil because they're hard to break down. So we see more of that, especially more under grass, than brassica, than legume, of those plant-derived compounds in that particulate organic matter fraction. And here's a nice cartoon of that we get more of those plant-derived parts in that particulate organic matter for grasses, slightly less for brassicas, and then legumes. This is just one study, but nice study. And then legumes, this is that the reason that more of that carbon is going into the mineral associated fraction is basically has to do with microbial biomass. So this theory, and this is really exciting that it was found in the field for cover cropping, is that higher quality organic matter inputs are processed more efficiently by microbes, and that they used it more efficiently, so that carbon is more likely to is more efficiently processed and more likely to be stabilized the soil. So that although, going back to our previous slide, there's less amount of the stuff going in, there's much more of that microbial biomass being stabilized on that mineral associated fraction. So basically, stuff that has higher quality potentially is going to be more likely to lead to more of this mineral associated organic matter stuff. So this is another cartoon of that low quality grasses is maybe potentially more of that stuff is going to go into this particulate organic matter pool, and that high quality stuff might be more likely to increase that mineral associated pool. And then the story, all these stories, is that combining some of these different gives more reason to combine some of these species. We want to potentially be increasing that particulate organic matter pool and that mineral associated pool together, so combining species can be a good way to do that. But I think it's pretty cool that it's not only just about the inputs, it's about quality, it's about more. So you might just see less crimson clover biomass, but there's more going on there. All right, so cover crop roots and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, another amazing story. And we heard a little bit about them in the last, but this is a really nice microscopy picture. I guess the only thing that, the only microscopy I have in this presentation, but basically these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi extend the network and are really important for accessing nutrients that move by diffusion, most importantly phosphorus and zinc and stuff like that. So the plant roots feeding them, and they're increasing that surface area to do more of that. And this is some more work from Penn State. They took some soils from that cover crop cocktail experiment, and then they grew corn. So basically you're seeing that these that are grasses, which is pretty common. Grasses tend to be the best hosts, kind of, I don't know, it depends on the study you look at, but grasses and legumes are good hosts, and grasses I think might be a little bit better at increasing mycorrhizal colonization and keeping those mycorrhizal happy in the soil before that corn that's going to use these. And we know that our brassicas are non-hosts for mycorrhizal fungi. So if you grew too many brassicas, you'd be potentially reducing those mycorrhizal fungi numbers in the soil. And in places like Australia or dry places that need to conserve moisture and sometimes do chemical fallows, they find that doing a chemical fallow for a long period of time can reduce these numbers so much that you can have this long fallow disorder where your mycorrhizae are depleted after that. So now on to aggregation. Being a soil health person, this is a really important topic. Really important constraint in our agricultural systems. Leave a field bare, clean till it for whatever, a soybean crop, and then we get these intense rainfall events that we're predicted to get more and more of these high intensity events in the spring, and then we're left with some intense surface crusting. So this is why aggregates and cover crops are really important for rebuilding that surface soil after those events, because if you're farming and growing soybeans or dry beans, you're going to have times like that where your soil's vulnerable. So potentially increasing that aggregate stability might give you some more resilience. Increasing your soil health is going to give you more resilience to those times. And some of the early work on how aggregates form really focused on these fine roots and mycorrhizal fungi, and also those polysaccharide glues. We hear that story most often, is that it's the glues that hold those aggregates together, but those fine roots and mycorrhizal fungi are really important for that. And there was a really cool study that eliminated the mycorrhizal fungi, and that had a huge impact on the aggregates in that small pot trial. So, like I was saying, these fine roots are huge players, and their associated arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are as well. Basically act like a finer root system extending off the root, and those can help increase aggregation. And this work is also hard to do because soil is variable, but a lot of the studies, I talked about annual ryegrass before. If annual ryegrass is included in the study, it usually comes out very well in terms of its effect on aggregate stability. So here was one study from our neighbors in Ontario that showed increases in aggregate stability after sorghum, Sudan grass, and annual ryegrass, and it was less under spring wheat and buckwheat, and that's just one example, but it also correlates with the total amount of root biomass that it had, and also these are grasses, and you can see when you dig up an annual ryegrass root how amazing that is, and also sorghum Sudan grass. So soil compaction is going to be the last topic I talk about. Another huge constraint in our agricultural systems, limiting our cash crop yields and limiting productivity in our agricultural systems, making our systems less resilient. There's potentially a lot of good stuff there, but if it's all bricks, they can't access it. So maybe this is the same soil, but one soil is very compacted, so it's only accessing a very small part of that nutrients and water that is there. And we can use a penetrometer to assess some of this stuff, and go out with a spade and also look at soil structure, seeing if there's those macropores that are there. But we know that some cover crop roots appear to be better at growing through more compacted soils than others. And here's some cool rhizotron images where they basically stick these plastic tubes in the soil and then drop cameras and take a bunch of pictures. It's a lot of work to do that stuff. So here's an image of some canola growing on the side of that tube. And then, since legume roots, our soybeans are babies when they're growing through the soil, they're not as well adapted to break through those compacted layers. They're more likely to just follow those preferential holes. So by building those preferential holes, you can help something like a soybean that's not as well adapted to growing through harder soil, and any cash crop. So here's some cool work he did. He basically stimulated some compaction at the field. In a no compaction situation, found that cereal rye did great. at growing through the soil. But when you started to add compaction to depth, it was those forage radish and that rapeseed that was better able to grow through that harder soil. And I really like this picture. This is pictures from some people in England that do some 3D X-ray imaging of cover crops and stimulated some compaction. And you can see what happened when that hairy vetch, that legume, got to that compacted layer. The root crooked, and this is a great indicator when you're out in the field. Understanding compaction is looking for root growth patterns. Are roots growing along compacted surface planes, or are they growing through? So in this picture, you can clearly see that forage radish and those grasses are better able to break through that compaction than the hairy vetch. So I probably went shorter than the time because I'm not piled higher and deeper yet, and not as good at talking for.
You're working on it.
I'm working on it.
You're working on it. You're getting there.
So the basics, and you know this stuff. Cover crops improve resource use efficiency, organic matter inputs, reduce environmental losses. We know all about these agronomic benefits at King's, and all you guys do a great job in doing that education. Cover crops, to borrow some terminologies from the Penn State group, are multifunctional and have trade-offs. And cover crops are biological tools, so they require adaptive management. It's not as easy as an input with one purpose. And this summarizes a lot of those slides, but there are some species-specific benefits. So if you're just looking for total biomass production, or if you're really worried about compaction, some of these species are better than others. And mixes may ameliorate that. I think the may is important, just so we don't get too carried away on the mixture train, but especially seeing that complementarity between a grass and a legume, there's so much benefit for combining them together, and thinking of diversity in terms of functional groups is really important. So with that, I'll take some questions, and I should have brought some cover crop posters. But yeah, any questions?
Yeah, Joseph, I have a question. Really interesting, especially this part about mineral-associated organic material. How much is known about that? Is it chemically just a few molecules, or are they large particles of organic material that associate with those minerals? And is that because of charges, or do you know anything about it?
Yeah, I'm not as much on the chemistry side, but yeah, I think there's a lot going on there. I think some of it is part with the physics and the physical occlusion of having these whatever in between clay particles, but then there's a lot of chemistry going on, adsorption of different functional groups onto minerals, and that's why the finer silt and clay particles have more of that surface area to have those relationships. Yeah. Yep.
So you put a chart up, I believe it was you, about the adoption of cover crop in the country.
Yeah.
And I have a two-part question about that. One, why are the numbers so pathetic? And two, why is Pennsylvania so much higher?
Than New York.
You saw the Muddy River, didn't you?
I did see the Muddy River. So what I'm trying to get at is, I'm looking for a good answer on how do we get more of the country to 50%.
Yeah, I mean, I think Maryland that has the highest, they're paying people $45 to $55 per acre for cover cropping, and some of the Penn State work has informed that work, which is really cool to see. But yeah, Chesapeake Bay policies have a huge reason why Pennsylvania has higher numbers than New York, and you guys don't have any drainage ditches. That's one thing Bob Schindelbeck always tells me, who's my colleague up at Cornell, is you come to Pennsylvania and you just see fields that are flat with the road, and when you go to New York, everywhere has got drainage issues. So drainage also has a role to play in longer growing season and stuff like that.
I was out in Illinois and asked them, oh, why don't they do cover crops? I was there. Well, they don't have they have a lot more soil. We don't have as much, so we can't afford to lose as much. It was kind of the story, because they have 5 or 6 foot of topsoil. They're not worried about cover crops and doing a lot of the stuff that cover crops bring. So that might be a part of the answer.
Yeah. I should have put the other slide. I took the one slide out where I had county results too. So there's more complexity to this story than just the state results. And you can see that Ridge and Valley province, that's greater than 15%, but other parts of PA are lower. Yeah, Lisa.
I'll just add too that this data can be presented in a different way by the percent of available acres that are cover crops, right? So Texas is a huge state with a lot of acreage, but still only probably 3 to 5% of the total acreage in Texas is cover crops. But in Pennsylvania, we're closer to like 33, 40% of our total available acreage is cover crops. So if you had that up there, you'd see that Chesapeake Bay region really stand out
Yeah.
for the percentage of cover crops
Cool.
that we're planting.
That makes sense.
I
Yeah,
think in
sorry.
the last 5 years, the adoption rate has gotten a lot higher in New York.
Yeah.
What I've seen.
Yeah, and I was looking at some of the NRCS funding for cover crop programs, and the funding for reducing tillage is about the same, but it's like cover crops. It's a good, yeah.
I think the other thing you
Sorry.
can look at is diversity in agriculture in the areas. Think about the Northeast and the diversity of crops that we grow and the opportunities that it lends us to incorporate cover crops into those versus the Midwest, corn, soybean.
Mm-hmm.
I used to live in Lebanon County, now I'm in Crawford, and we don't have the heat to get it accomplished. I'd like to do more and plant things in mid-October, nothing barely grows, so you don't get the advantage. So
Yeah.
That's a big issue too.
No, makes sense.
Another issue is culture. I mean, we're in the southwestern Virginia. Everybody's a month behind where they should be on harvesting hay and planting corn. There's just not enough of get up and go to get seed in the ground,
Yeah.
to get cover crop. I mean, a lot of farmers do, but they're a month behind.
Yeah.
You know.
No, there's a lot of limitations.
So I think that's a great point, because wherever you go, you're in Virginia, for crying out loud. We're in New York. We have this long of grocery, and you got this long.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you are. You're always going to want. Well, I got to grow 120-day corn because I can get a little bit more yield. Well, I'm in New York. I can only grow 105-day corn. It's up here. It's not in the growing season.
No, I mean, our people want to plant 120 day or 115 day corn on the 1st of June when they should be planting on the 25th of April.
Out there
25th
has
of
on
April.
control
They just
what he's saying.
Yeah, it's
Virginia
just a
should be
cultural
able to do it
thing.
with ease.
more than anything.
He has a point.
I'll put one more plug in. On Friday, Brosie had emailed me. They're actually gonna, New Columbia, if anybody's local, gonna share some of that cover crop cocktail research there.
Cool. Yeah, no, you should hear it more from the source. I helped a tiny bit with the project, so I should have put those names up and did it. But that's awesome. Gonna get breakfast with Brosie on tomorrow. Hey, how's it going?
Good. The other thing too is I'm like right on the New York-Pennsylvania border. I'm in New York, and I work with a lot of producers from Pennsylvania and New York. And Pennsylvania does a way better job than New York getting the information out to the producers in the NRCS. Like the producers in Pennsylvania, they know the programs, they know what's going on, and I have a working relationship with those extension agents in the NRCS group. Where New York, I don't know. There's a disconnect. It's like Penn State does a better job too than.
Yep.
Cornell.
We're working on it. No, we were just.
Not loud number of times,
No,
so
no.
I'm not afraid,
I
but
think we know. We need. There's a lot of
I
work
don't
to be
know
done.
why, but it's just I see it every day.
And I think
Pennsylvania does it.
NRCS and soil water and having everyone knowledgeable about the different programs is so important
And
because.
they do offer more money.
Yeah. So there's a lot of money coming from the state of New York. So hopefully that'll change. and we'll have a better answer. And I think we do need to have kind of a one-stop shop where you go to somebody and they can tell you about what soil water can offer you, tell you about what NRCS can offer you, can tell you what CC can offer you, because it is complicated.
Yeah, I do a pollinator mix for Pennsylvania, and it's mind-boggling how many pounds of that seed I sell. It's from 1 pound to, 400 pounds.
Wow.
It's a lot.
That's cool. Sweet. Thank you.
You'll stay up here, I guess, for the time.
Oh, yeah.